Welcome to our show about child sexual abuse and the legal system. My name is Heather Holben-West. I'm the counselor at the Sexual Assault Response Center. Today we're going to shed some light on what happens in the legal system when a sexual assault occurs. And we'll also be talking about maybe some reactions that the victim and their families would have during that process. We'll begin with some basic statistics and sexual assault myths. I'm joined today by Brandi Ralston, Education Outreach Coordinator for the Sexual Assault Response Center. Thank you for joining us, Brandi.
Hi.
Can you start off by telling us how many kids sexual assault affects?
Yeah, so some of our national statistics show that as many as 1 in 5 boys and 1 in 3 girls are sexually assaulted before the age of 18, and also that it's one of the most underreported crimes, and as many as 60% of cases are never reported. And one factor that may lead to a victim not reporting is that an estimated 95% of people know they're offenders.
So it happens a lot. It sounds like it affects a lot of people.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And were there some other myths that you wanted to talk about? Because I think that would probably be important in terms of reporting and how that affects the children coming forward.
Yeah, so we have a couple of myths that I'd like to talk about today.
Okay.
And the first myth is that child sexual abuse is rare. And unfortunately, we know from the statistics that it is something that's not very rare. And at our agency last year, we had about 400 new clients, and about 300 of those clients were under the age of 18, so they were kids and minors.
And then what are some of the other myths?
So another myth is that children under the age of 10 are safe from sexual abuse, and unfortunately that is not true. For children under the age of 5, last year about 25% of our children were under the age of 5 for our clients. About 50% were under the age of 12, and about 75% of our clients are under the age of 18. So it's something that affects a lot of children.
A majority children?
Yes.
Okay.
So another one of the myths that we would like to cover is that if someone looks normal and they act normal, then they can't be a sex offender. And that is not true. A lot of people think that if someone looks normal and they act normal, then they are not a sex offender, they can't be a sex offender. But a lot of sex offenders know that their image is very important, and they like to manipulate people based on things like their image and how they act. In Benton and Franklin counties, we have about 700 registered sex offenders, so there are a lot in our area.
So just because they look okay doesn't mean they're necessarily a safe person?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. I think that's really important for the community to understand and to know that a lot of times they look safe or are probably the most safe people that we would assume, and they're not. So it's important to know maybe some of the red flags and stuff that goes along with that, which we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, and there is no certain profile for a sex offender. A lot of people think that a sex offender is going to look or act a certain way, and they can really be anybody, a male or a female, any race, any socioeconomic status. They can, have different relationships with the victim, from anything from a parent, a caregiver, a grandparent or aunt or uncle, and, things like priests or coaches or even youth group leaders.
So really anybody it can be?
Yes,
okay.
Really anybody.
Which is important to know, I think, for parents and for the community members as well.
Yes.
Now, what happens in terms of children always telling or assuming that?
So a lot of people assume that a child is always going to tell, or that their child will come to them if something happens. And a lot of times children either wait to talk about what happened to them, or they may never tell either. So if maybe sometimes the child may tell, or they may wait for a little while to tell, or if they do end up disclosing, they may not tell the whole story of what happened to them. So that's very common as well. And that can also be affected by the fact that their predator against them may have threatened them or may have groomed them, and so they're very scared to tell or not willing to come forward and talk about what happened with them.
Now, you mentioned the word grooming, Brandi, which I'd like to take a minute and just talk more about, because I think it's a really crucial part of sexual abuse, but not a lot of people have knowledge about it or understand what it is. Grooming is a psychological process that sex offenders take their victims through prior to any sexual touch. And the goal is to break down their emotional and physical boundaries in order to gain the child's trust and make sure that they keep the secret about abuse. I think it's also important to know that offenders not only groom their victims, but they also groom caregivers, families, and the community, so that if the child were to come forward and tell, they'd be less likely to be believed. Grooming has a lot of stages. First, the sex offender will identify the child. then they will desensitize them to touch, engage them in a peer-like relationship, isolate that child, and then finally they'll make them feel responsible for the abuse. And I like to take some time and just kind of break each of those down. In terms of identifying the child, that can be a really detailed process, and a lot of times an offender will have a group of children in mind, and then just based on different personality types and the amount of support that child has, they'll narrow that down to a couple of children to begin the grooming process with. After they pick their child, they'll engage in a peer-like relationship. So they'll act as if they have the same interests, they'll take them and do fun things. A lot of times offenders will bribe children with toys, video games, that kind of thing. One sex offender described it as acting like a kid with keys in a checkbook. The reason that they do this is to gain the child's trust and to become an important person in their life and really build a close, trusting relationship with that child. After they have that, they'll move forward and start to desensitize the child to touch. So they do this in a lot of different ways. They may engage in a lot of physical contact, so they'll have a lot of hugs, kisses, massages. A lot of times offenders will engage the children in play wrestle or tickling games and that kind of stuff, where maybe they accidentally brush the private part of the child just to test their reaction and see what they do. If the child doesn't react, they'll move forward with their grooming process. It's just sort of a series of tests. Certain offenders may also expose the children further to naked bodies or pornography to desensitize them and break down their physical boundaries. Once that happens, they'll begin to isolate the child and pull away their supports. So they may do this by saying things like, I'm the only one who understands you, I'm the only one who cares about you, and you can trust. This encourages a closer, more secretive relationship with the offender, and it also makes it less likely that they'll have people to turn to for help if they decide they want to talk about the abuse. At this point, the sexual abuse actually occurs. And after that, the offender will make the child feel responsible. So again, they do this in a lot of different ways. They may tell the child, well, this is what you do when you love somebody, this is what you do when you care, and don't you care about me, making them feel guilty. A common tool is an offender will have the child engage in a sexual activity to them so that the child feels like they made an active choice to participate in the abuse and feel guilty about that, and like they might get in trouble. Another thing that the offender might do is remind them of all the fun they've had and the things they've gotten them. They may threaten that they'll hurt them or their family, or if you come forward, you'll get in trouble, I'll get in trouble, your mom or dad will be mad, and there'll be all this collateral damage. And that's really confusing for children, and it's really hard for them to come forward because they really do believe through the grooming process that they will get in trouble. In terms of, I guess, feeling loyalty to the offender, this I think is the difficult part for the community members to understand sometimes, is this really is an important person in their life. The child may not like the sexual abuse, but they do value the relationship with the offender, and it's set up to be that way, so that they feel very conflicted about getting someone they care about in trouble, especially if it's a parent or a step-parent or a caregiver or a close family friend. So there's a lot to consider there, which I think kind of goes into the next myth that you were going to talk about in terms of children lying about abuse to get attention.
Yeah, so there is a myth out there that children will lie about abuse to get some sort of attention, whether it's good or bad attention, and that's just really not the case. Things change a lot in a child's world after an allegation comes forward, from, their family turning against them, they're not believing them, having maybe the primary breadwinner not be in the home anymore and creating a lot of hardships, or even being put in foster care. So that's a lot for a child to have to face, just to have an allegation come forward and have that allegation not be true. So most children don't make up any sort of allegations of sexual abuse or sexual assault.
Absolutely. There's a lot to deal with when you come forward.
Yes.
Most kids don't take that risk without a reason.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So then the next myth I'd kind of like to talk about is that a lot of times community members think that when there's sexual abuse that there will be some sort of physical sign that they'll be able to tell, and a lot of times that's just not the case. Many victims of sexual assault don't have any physical evidence on them or have any injuries that anybody can see, and it's especially the case with child victims because a lot of times the exams for a child victim can be put off. They're not on the same day that the abuse happened, and it can be very, very difficult for them to find any sort of physical evidence in that situation.
Absolutely. I think that's an important thing to say, because I think a lot of community members don't know that information based on things that they may see on TV or different kind of things that may not be as accurate.
Yeah, as accurate.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And then the last myth I kind of want to talk about, you've talked about it already, that children may not dislike their offender. A lot of times people think that the child will hate the offender, but a lot of times the children do still care about the person that offended against them. You know, if it's a family member or someone in their household, and the normal community out there may not realize that, you know, they still love this person, they still care about them, they just don't like the sexual act that occurred against them or the sexual abuse that occurred against them in that situation.
Absolutely. And I think that's one hard thing that I deal with as a counselor, is helping the children deal with those conflicting feelings and emotions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Children should be happy and safe. Those who have been sexually abused are more likely to become pregnant, engage in violence, do poorly in school, run away from home, and have low self-esteem. If you're worried about a child, get involved. Call the Sexual Assault Response Center at 374-5391. Together we can make a difference in the life of a child. Call 374-5391.
Welcome back to our show about sexual assault in the legal system. I'm now joined by Sondra Dixon, a sexual assault advocate at SARC, and Terry Bloor of the Benton County Prosecutors Office. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.
Sondra, I'll start with you. Can you explain a little bit about what the process is once an allegation is made?
Sure. So of course, you know, every case is going to vary depending on the age of the child, depending on the allegation itself. But generally speaking, there's a, you know, sort of a typical process that does take place. This process starts out with the actual allegation of child sexual abuse, and this oftentimes is actually from a disclosure from the child, his or herself. And from there, this should be reported to law enforcement. It can also be reported to CPS if, Child Protective Services, that is, if the alleged offender is living within the home, if there's some sort of concern about the home and the child's safety there. But I'm just going to be kind of focusing on the law enforcement side of things. So once that allegation is reported to law enforcement, the case is usually referred to a detective. That detective then has a series of steps to take. Some of those steps, and usually the first step that that detective will take is the forensic interview of the child. Now, in our community, we have a special program for this. It's called our Kids Haven program, and it's a joint program, a joint effort was put in place to create more cohesive, more consistent process for these investigations. What happens during this interview, and the room, there's a special interviewing room. Excuse me. This interviewing room is located at the Sexual Assault Response Center. It has an observation room so that the detective, sometimes the prosecuting attorney, as well as any CPS investigators that are involved, they can observe the interview of the child in this room at the time that it's occurring. It's also set up for DVD recordings and audio recordings, so that kind of to minimize the amount of times that the child might have to be interviewed, which is really nice for that child not to have to tell their story over and over again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this child is brought to the Kids Haven program, and they're interviewed by a professional interviewer. She is a child forensic interviewer. She's trained to ask open-ended, non-leading questions just to ensure a very, I guess I would say, accurate,
really
valid investigation. So this is beneficial for the child. It's also beneficial for the, the detective, the investigation, and ultimately prosecution if it gets to that point as well, which Terry will talk a little bit more about. So those are some of the next steps, those interviews, collecting that corroborating evidence. Part of that could be ordering a child forensic medical exam. This is different from a regular medical exam. This exam has to be requested through that law enforcement agency, and it takes place usually, during the investigation, which could be, years after the abuse has actually occurred, depending on when the allegation was made or when the disclosure came out. But there's a doctor the doctor uses special equipment to be able to detect if there are any physical evidence to indicate that the child has had physical trauma from the abuse. But as Brandi had already said, this physical evidence is usually just not that common. If there isn't any evidence found during this medical exam, it by no means means that the abuse did not take place, but children do heal very quickly, and it's difficult to really determine anything from the exam, but it still can at times be an important step to take. So that's another one of the steps, and from there, as I said before, the rest of the interviews would take place, and ultimately the interview of the suspect or the alleged offender would also take place. And sometimes the detective may ask the alleged offender to come in for a polygraph test. However, this isn't admissible in court. Again, not incredibly reliable piece for the investigation, but sometimes it can be useful in other ways.
Okay.
So that's sort of the general process of the investigation. And then really quickly, our role as advocates we're there essentially to support the family and the victim of abuse. We offer information, community referrals, therapy referrals, as well as the general support throughout the entire process, just to help as much as we can with the healing process and to help guide them through the legal system, since it can be pretty frustrating for families. It's not quick. It's can be very long, drawn out. Families are going to be going through a range of emotions during this time. They might be feeling angry, frustrated, confused.
Absolutely. It can be tricky to navigate.
Yes.
Definitely. And so sometimes it can be important and helpful for families to have that support person to kind of show them where to go. Can you speak a little bit about what happens once the investigation is finished and then it goes to the prosecutor's office?
Right. So after all those steps have basically been completed, the detective is then going to send it over to the prosecuting attorney for review. And from there, and I won't speak too much since I know that Terry could speak to this, but from there it's up to the prosecutor whether or not he or she is going to file charges. There is another myth out there that families can choose to press charges or not to press charges. That's just not true. There are no pressing charges, but the prosecutor is the one who would file charges if the case is strong enough to be able to do that, and other reasons. However, families don't quite understand all the time that though the crime occurred against the child, and yes, the family is directly affected, once it's been reported, it's not up to them. It's up to, because basically it's a crime against the state. So the state takes it over, and that's why the family can't necessarily choose, but they're they are taken into consideration, of course, and they will meet with their prosecutor, and their voice will still be heard. So they will have some participation and some input, but ultimately the decision is up to the prosecutor.
I think one helpful way to think about it, a prosecutor explained it to me once, that the prosecutor and their office is in the driver's seat and the family's in the passenger. So they can kind of help navigate and give input, but really the prosecutor's in the driver's seat. At that point, it's out of their hands.
Which can be a relief to a lot of families.
Absolutely.
To not have to make that decision.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that information.
You're welcome.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the process leading up to the prosecution of the crime, and I'd like to get some of that information from you, Terry. So can you give us an explanation of how a decision is made on whether or not to charge for sexual abuse, child sexual abuse?
I think we look at two main questions. First of all, are we satisfied that the crime actually did happen? That's the first thing. If we're not, it's very unlikely that we'll actually file charges. But let's say we're satisfied. We are as reasonably certain as we can be that the allegation by a child or an adult that he or she has been sexually molested is true. Then the next question is much harder, and that question is, can we actually prove it in court? And the issue there is not, did it likely happen, did it probably happen, but can we prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt? And that can be a tough issue.
Very difficult. Very, very difficult. And I think a lot of times on our end with families, there's not really an understanding and sort of an interpretation on their part. Well, they don't believe that this happened, which isn't the case. You know, what happened and what you can prove are often two very different things.
That's correct.
Absolutely. I guess going along with that, after a case is charged, what happens?
Well, in court, the defendant will be summoned into court, or he'll be arrested. He'll appear before a judge. The judge will set bail if he is in custody. If he's not in custody, the judge will, in either case, set some pretrial dates and a trial date. Frankly, although the witnesses, the family, the child, the adult probably knows what happened, it never comes off that quickly. And you can almost guarantee, almost count on a continuance, one or two continuances at least in a case of this nature. After all, it is a very, very serious case, and it has lifetime consequences if somebody wants to admit that they've molested a child or been or abused an adult sexually. You know, the registration consequences are almost always going to be there. The charge itself carries some very significant probation as well as prison or jail time. So the defendant and the defendant's attorney is going to be very, very careful before they choose to either go to trial or choose to plead guilty.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's good probably that they take their time, and that also on the prosecutor's end you take your time in considering all the evidence and if you really want to move forward, because it does mean a lot of your time and the family's, you know, emotionally, physically, logistically, all that to proceed forward.
Yes, and there are going to be consequences for the family and the victim.
Right.
Even though the victim has probably been forensically interviewed, even though that interview might be on videotape, the defendant, or more specifically the defendant's attorney, will probably want to speak to that child, speak to the adult in person. So even though there might be a videotape of what has been said before, you know, that probably is not going to end the case as far as the child goes, or the victim goes. And then if it does go to trial, of course the child or the adult, the victim, will have to get up on the stand in front of a jury, 12 people that they've never seen before, and talk about some sexual misconduct that happened to them.
I guess speaking to that, in your opinion, what do you think is the most difficult thing for a jury to believe in a child sexual assault case?
Well, I think the most difficult thing is just to believe that it happens. You know, first of all, to use this current example, the Penn State example, by all accounts, the assistant coach was a great guy. You know, by all accounts, he was charitable, nice to the players, you know, good coach, model citizen in all other respects. And I've seen many people on TV say, I just can't understand, how could this possibly happen? Well, the hardest thing for jurors to think about is to say, yes, it does happen. It was said before, these people don't carry name tags. They don't have badges saying, I am a child molester. A child molester might be your favorite uncle. It might be your next door neighbor who is, you know, always willing to lend an extra hand, mow your yard if you need help, carry in groceries. It might be anybody. And the hardest thing for a jury, I think, is just to wrap their heads around the idea that some people, unfortunately, are attracted to minors.
That there could be pedophilia.
Yes, that there are people out there who think of 10-year-olds sexually.
Well, and I think that speaks to that grooming process too, and part of being a pillar of the community and a model citizen is grooming the community.
Absolutely.
So that people would think, well, not him, it has to be, you know, the traditional, what you think of as a traditional sex offender, and the scary guy. You know, not a female or an attractive young man with a wife and a family and, you know, involved in lots of community.
Right, and that's actually very, very few times are you going to have the scary guy jumping out of the bushes, grabbing a child, and pulling them away from a mother. It almost always is going to be that next door neighbor, the person that is known by the child from school, a relative. It's always going to be somebody, almost always going to be somebody that the child knows and that appears to be trustworthy.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that is difficult. What would you say is the most difficult about prosecuting a sexual assault case on your end?
Well, I think the most difficult thing is just recognizing that the default position, the position that most people want to have, is that this never occurred, that everything's fine, that no abuse occurred, that the victim must have somehow misunderstood things, but everything will be fine. Let's go home and let's forget about this. The difficult thing is that by the nature of it, there aren't going to be witnesses other than the perpetrator and the victim. In almost all cases, there's not going to be physical evidence. DNA is not often present in sex cases. Fingerprints are not often found in sex cases. So in most cases, it's going to be one person's word against another's. And as I said, people would rather believe that nothing bad happened. So the difficult part is to try to convince a jury that this person should be believed and should be believed beyond a reasonable doubt.
The legal process is obviously very complicated, and victims and their families go through a lot. Each case is very different in the way they handle it, and I'd like to thank everyone for your time and knowledge on this topic. And if you want more information about sexual abuse and the legal system, you can contact the Sexual Assault Response Center at 509-374-5391. Thank you.